behavior and how we interact with all the objects in the vehicle and the surrounding environment around us. So lots of different uses. There's no singular use of all this data. Unfortunately, even the vehicle manufacturers don't have access to it all. So no one can really tell you all the components which are flowing around in there.
Yeah, and I'll just go back to the EDR data because the title is From Black Box to the Future. The black box, and I just hate that term. That's sort of a holdover from aviation, or ships have black boxes. But here's what the black box had, folks. The black box had, folks. So 5 seconds prior to the impact, this car is sort of recording things all the time and then getting rid of it and recording it again. There is a deployment of the airbag. And then the car says, well, let's capture the last 5 seconds. Now, the federal government's proposed a longer time period is being disputed right now. But it only captures about 30 signals. And the car manufacturers can decide what they want to have in that black box, but there's not much. So I'm going to stop calling it the black box, and you should too. So the event data recorder, or what is the EDR, captures 5 seconds. Hopefully everybody's nodding their head now. Okay, I got it. This is a really important foundational point for what we're going to be talking about. And for people that know this, I apologize, but not everybody does. So then you look at the data. So there's about 30 signals it's capturing, but some of that's redundant. So let's just call it 20 unique signals. Okay, 20 is not a lot. But now, to make it even more narrow, that data is being recorded at about 0.2 of a second. Now, that may sound like a really small time frame, but vehicles that are being put in the marketplace today, and I'm talking about virtually all vehicles, are recording the data, as Bryan just talked about, in its computer system at 1/1000th of a second. And as we like to say in our world, a lot happens in that second. So being able to slice the data down to the microsecond, which is another way of saying thousandths of a second, is incredibly important. What happened first from sequencing standpoints? And as Bryan's also alluded to, there's so much data on different signals. So I can tell you, for instance, that each car manufacturer is doing this differently. But if we were to use Tesla as the prototype for this discussion, Tesla's recording about enough data to generate 2,500 signals. So on one hand, you got 30 signals, some of which is redundant, 2,500 signals. Then these 2,500 signals are generated at 1/1000th of a second, and these are generated at 0.2 of a second. Now here's the real payoff. That 5-second interval on an EDR is infinite on all modern vehicles. You can go back and look extensively at what was going on. Not that you need to. You probably only need somewhere around 30 or 40 seconds, but we've seen cases where it's really helpful to understand what was going on 3 minutes ago. What kind of systems were enabled then? Now, the car manufacturers, as they talk about these EDR devices and the need to modernize them, they're worried about their data getting out. They're also worried because the attorneys told them to worry. They're also worried because they're worried that this stuff is going to somehow become something that is used as a weapon against them. And understand all that. But the important point here is the data exists in a different form, in a different location, and that's incredibly useful in the accident. Now, the payoff pitch here is that data, and it varies with each manufacturer, is being beamed from the car, and it's being beamed through embedded modems that are in the car. So if you have a car that's built from 2020 onwards to present day all have embedded modems, and it is exactly what you think it is. It's a device that's transmitting data. Um, if you look behind what you think of as your rear view mirror and you see something that looks like a shaded box or a trapezoid, that's the embedded modem, and it also contains the forward-facing cameras and the radar units. And that's where all the magic happens. So that data goes to the cloud, and again, using Tesla as an example, it happens within a second, and it records what happened in an accident, including video. So with all of that, you get once you get that payload of data and video, it's so much different than the EDR. And hopefully there's a lot of people going, oh, I get it. We're not talking about black box or EDR data anymore. Bryan, I went on a little bit long, but hopefully everybody caught the differentiation and you can add to that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that while most, and I wouldn't say all, I do think there are still some vehicles sold out there around the world that don't have this capability yet, and probably a lot overseas. While this data does exist to a greater degree in all modern vehicles, so your newest vehicles, high-tech vehicles, obviously more than stuff that was engineered 5 years ago. I don't think this data is all seamlessly transmitted and recorded the same as Tesla. I do think that the bulk of the legacy auto industry is still chasing that gold standard. There are definitely some standouts out there who are getting close, but the data architecture that the team at Tesla built is second to none. There is more data moving out of Tesla vehicles, video, select processing of that data on board so that you don't upload everything than anything else out there. I think that is the gold standard that much of the industry is working towards, but I do not think that the entire industry is there yet. I think there are multiple players in the industry that the data is used within the vehicle, and no one within that organization could actually come back to figure out how to reconstruct that because the suppliers were all involved in understanding that. So the subroutines are communicating, but no one understands what happens within those subroutines. Part of this is much like the technical struggles that you had getting on here, Mike, is that the automation is so complex, no one really knows how to diagnose and triage the automation anymore. So you have, in many of the manufacturers out there, systems that work, and we quite frankly don't know why until something breaks, and all of a sudden we're scratching our heads trying to figure it out. So I do not, wish the audience to think about that every car has all these capabilities. Most manufacturers, these are the capabilities they're striving to. But I think that there's a lot of data being beamed up to nothing right now. The car is transmitting, but the back end capabilities to receive all that, or were a dream and never built out fully.
And that's an important point. The car manufacturers put these systems to make the cars generate learning and make the cars perform better. But I was actually at an MIT meeting, I'd say 4 or 5 MIT AVT consortium, which is what Bryan runs. And this is about 2022. I remember we just sort of emerged from COVID. And there's a woman in the back of the room from Honda, and she raised her hand and she goes, "We didn't build this data for you guys. We built this for running cars." Well, yeah, but as an unintended consequence, the data exists. And so some car manufacturers have known about that issue for a while, but we're mentioning this because there's a lot of turf battle now about who has rights to that data. Forget ownership. Ownership's an important discussion, but the most important thing here is that the data exists. So what data exists? And as we start to lean into more automation, as we start to lean into more electrification, as we start to lean into more use of cameras, we're going to start to see completely different buckets of data. But the most important thing is, okay, that data exists. And for you participants in the audience, it's going to be important to say, what data? And then the next question is, how do I get it? So, Bryan, I'm going to move us into that next phase of the conversation. So again, using Tesla as the gold standard, as Bryan's referred to, and there are probably a couple other manufacturers maybe past Tesla. So there's a Chinese car manufacturer called BYD, which is a technically advanced vehicle. I've never worked on a BYD case. I'd be shocked if they weren't doing everything Tesla's using. And Rivian is, which mimics Tesla in many ways, and I've seen their data. They do capture data the exact same way Tesla does. The issue is, and I'll just use a Rivian example we had a couple of weeks ago. An insurance company that had an accident involving a Rivian, and the driver was claiming that his Rivian, when it was in a parking lot, just plowed through a Dunkin' Donut shop wall, and it did it on its own. And so this insurance company is like, how do we solve this problem? They went to an accident reconstructionist who was either not up on this or wanted to do something different. And they said, well, it's going to cost $30,000. Here's the budget. And we're going to fly 2 experts in, and we're going to pull the data out of the cloud. And we were like, stop, don't do that. Get the customer who owns the car to go to Rivian. We'll show you how to get it. Click on the menu, and within 24 hours, we not only had the data, but we digested it. And you could see conclusively, without a doubt, the driver has stepped on the accelerator. And importantly, the car or truck, because Rivians are either SUVs or trucks, did not contribute to this vehicle driving through the Dunkin' Donuts wall. And there was some serious injuries. So I hope that illustrates the point of a lot of this data is going to a cloud. And then the other side of this is, if you think you're going to go to the car and just say, open sesame and get the data out, that's not going to happen. So maybe, Bryan, if you could speak to data retrieval out of cars. I know you work on this space a lot.
So most of the data moving around in modern cars is either encrypted or moving around in networks in hex versus binary format. So it's not necessarily readable by the human eye. It's got to be translated using a translation guide.
Bryan, for the normal humans, hexadecimal.
Hexadecimal, okay.
And
Use
so
big words.
it's a different kind of computer language than even programmers use, right?
Correct. So for all in simplicity, it's just another language that if you look at it, it looks like a Chinese scripture written 100 years ago, not in English and digestible in numerical form. Now, there are translation guides that all the manufacturers have, and these signals are all built on, and those translation guides are a necessity, or some advent of those, to functionally interpret this information. There are some ways that you can that some have reverse engineered certain signals in certain cases using brute force approaches, but by and large, that would be impossible for thousands of signals in realistic time. And the translation guides also come with simple information. This is in kilometers or this is in miles an hour. And while that may be a simple thing to think about, but there's lots of vehicles out there that are global platforms in nature, and the information in the vehicle might be in the metric system, but it's not displayed that way to the consumer. So I think when you begin to think about the data infrastructure in vehicles, you have to really remember that most of the vehicles that we have on the road today have been iteratively developed over time, plugging systems together that existed. Even when we think about modern platforms like Tesla, they didn't reinvent all the subsystems. They reinvented the architecture that connected the subsystems. So the automotive industry has been growing and growing for decades, really as a patchwork of connecting existing systems together. And we have not taken a step back and looked at how do we begin to strategically use elements of this patchwork system. And that's both within the car as well as outside the vehicle. Very little connection between, the rules and the laws that are built around vehicle safety, the insurance industry, and the repair industry, and the automakers who are generating data that can help them all. So when we begin to take a step back, we can begin to understand to a much greater degree that the data flowing in vehicles has an incredible value beyond that of the manufacturer alone. And that data has to be translated, and the only really viable way to translate it is the manufacturer and the suppliers who built the systems. The question becomes is how to create the economic incentive that this data actually has a lot more value than just the development of better vehicle systems. And that is an area that Mike and I have extensively discussed. While his interest remains in the reconstruction and mitigation of the unknowns and accidents, I believe the data is critical to managing, at the fleet level, incentives to reasonably insure drivers based upon the risk that they are taking, to reasonably understand how do we encourage more advent driver behavior, and perhaps even connecting over to the enforcement side of the world so that we do build a system that is more safe, more convenient, and more optimally deployed than we have today.
What a great summary. Thanks, Bryan. There's this groundswell of debate about who should have access to this, and sometimes privacy shows up. And it's some car makers' position that, we don't want to make that data available because A, we own it. I disagree with that fundamentally. B, there's a privacy concern, and a car manufacturer made this argument the other day. We have to be careful that we don't disclose location of someone because maybe there's a protective order or abusive spouse out there. There's a number of, you can make this more complicated if you need to, but you don't have to. The accident happened, the data exists. That's a grounding set of principles. So the reason why you want the data is not so you can necessarily sue the insurance company, sue the automaker, but so that you can understand what happened. And you won't understand what happened unless you can see the accident. So if once you understand what happened in the accident, only then can you say, what do I do about it? Or what are the repercussions of it? Is it making it a safer car? Did the driver do it? Did the car do it? And it's important because there are automation aspects of this car right now. And so many times, human beings are always terrible witnesses, but they don't even know sometimes what the car is doing or why the car did whatever it did. And only that information in the car will give us all a better understanding of what took place. And so as a society, my position on this is it's not about privacy. It's not about ownership. It's this car is on the road, potentially injuring other people, potentially not performing well, or the driver may not be driving well and it's not the car's fault. But in the event of an accident, we need to understand, because we as a society have a right to drive these cars or walk these sidewalks with other cars, and we need to be able to do it in a safe manner. So I think it's more of a social compact that you have to get to.
And Mike, I think what's interesting to me is I would take a step up and back from that. And I think we need to use the data that exists to make us as humans better. Much like I talk about in my forthcoming book, AI as an augmenter of human capability. And the data we're talking about here can be used to support us more effectively to mitigate and prevent outcomes that traditionally would be inevitable. So if we are coaching, supporting, whatever framework or words we want to use here, a driver in real time using this data and the tools that this data may enable, we can prevent more accidents and adverse events on the road than we have today. So, it's really hard when we think about, major safety issue today is excessive speeding. Law enforcement doesn't want to get involved for a lot of reasons that pulling over someone comes with risks. The insurance companies, do have a tool that they can use that they're not necessarily capable of using today around pricing. And I say not capable because of how the insurance laws work in various states. But more importantly, the vehicle in and of itself has this information and can begin to broadcast that. So when automation accelerates, it's a lot different than when humans accelerate. And Mike's bringing a video up here, which should be interesting.
And so if you could bring that video back after it stops and show it again from the very beginning. And we have absolute permission to use this and show it to you, and there's no privacy concerns. So, Bryan, why did this happen?
I'm guessing there is no driver at the wheel.
No, there's a driver.
Is there a driver?
Yeah.
Being controlled by a little of the automation in aspects and ways that they weren't fully aware of?
Yeah, we're going to ask the audience to maybe spend a couple seconds and tell us what they're thinking as they can hit chat. You're not required to, but this is a very fun exercise. I'll give you the background on this a little bit. A plaintiff attorney contacted me and said, I have this client. He insists he didn't do it. He's in his driveway facing outwards, and so the car went crazy. He's got 3 young children in the back seat, and they were all seriously injured. So we got this assignment. Again, I want to drive home how quickly this can happen. The data was retrieved, and and we did our analysis of that data. Now, I'm with Nelson Law, but there's also a company that I helped found called Quantum Risk. And Quantum Risk will look at data like this and make it understandable. And anybody wants to see a demo of that at any point, feel free to reach back out to us. But hopefully, if you wanted to add some thoughts about what just happened, fine. I'm going to show it one more time. And Kristen, I'm going to ask you to bring it up and then sort of slow it down halfway through its journey, okay? So this is in Queens. You can see that median there. That separates one side versus the other side of the road. We're over this median. And kudos to the driver. He gets it back over the median again. He's down through a stop sign, avoids the car, and into the house. You still don't know what happened in the accident because you don't have the data. You can see it. Videos are helpful, but anybody who thinks videos are going to be able to explain what took place. We like to think of videos as giving context to the data, but the data is not going to show it went over a median once and then twice. It's not going to show the speed, the acceleration, and people like to talk about speed. I think acceleration is a much more important issue to focus on when you're looking at what happened. And then, was it automation? So I'll get to the bottom line on this one. No, this driver, his driver's door was stuck on a small wall in his driveway. And his solution to getting his car unstuck was to tap the accelerator a little bit. A lot of you have probably done it. I know I've done this too. And when he tapped his accelerator a little bit, he probably was then trying to close his door. And before he knew it, the car started to move, and now he's over the median. So, Christian, if you could just bring this video up one more time. We're not going to dominate the rest of this thing with this video, but a little narration will help. So you'll see he's not moving very quickly. But now he's starting to, and now he's panicking as a human being. And he's stepping on the brakes, or at least in his mind he is. Now, Bryan, I've given you some data. So
Pedal misapplication.
yeah, and explain what pedal misapplication is.
Fundamentally, there's a long track record of humans feeling like they're pressing on the brake, but are actually sitting on the accelerator. This is the root foundations of numerous accidents, and we have, as humans, are not perfect. There have been multiple technologies. So brake override is the technological term for it. If you're pushing both brakes, but there have been numerous efforts to try to understand how to position the pedals to mitigate pedal misapplication. In several cases, you have the driver pushing both the accelerator and the brake at the same time. And quite frankly, especially in electric vehicles, it would not surprise me if the accelerator wins. We think about electric vehicles around their environmental aspects, but these are sports cars. They have been marketed extensively for their environmental benefits, but at the end of the day, their performance benefits are of very fast sports cars with acceleration characteristics that are amazing. So wouldn't surprise me if in this case, pedal misapplication is a broad term. He may be just pushing on the accelerator, pushing harder and harder, thinking he's pushing on the brake, and the car is accelerating properly. He's the problem, or he might be pushing on both pedals. And there have been landmark studies of both in multiple situations that have occurred over the decades that have passed. And this is a mistuning of the human brain combined with the technology we've created to provide input to the vehicle.
And at the time you're trying to get your car to let you move the door off the parapet wall, your door's not even closed. How attuned is the driver to what the driver is doing in that situation? And this is a space Bryan's really focused in on.
85% of us believe we're above average drivers. Most of us are never distracted. We only pick up the phone occasionally when we can. For all the obvious reasons, we are relatively unaware of the minute behaviors that we engage in on a moment-to-moment basis in the vehicle. So as we take a step up and a step back, we need to remember that humans in and of themselves are far from perfect. We are amazing creatures. We make instinctual decisions with impartial information. But at the end of the day, we are far from perfect. We need help working with many of these advanced technologies and driving much in the same way we need help with our email and opening up Zoom from time to time. Those support systems don't yet exist in vehicles, and that's an area of active research and amongst the team that I work with. But we need to be moving to really thinking of supporting the driver as a cohesive safety component of the vehicle as opposed to replacing the driver much more in the co-pilot sense than the autopilot sense, where we can be thinking about how the capabilities of the driver are fused more strategically with driver support systems and active safety systems. But this requires a step back and understanding how the data is portraying on roads and looking at those cases from a much higher vantage point. Too much of our industry today has been focused on the pursuit of safety at all costs. We need to be putting more sensors, more technology on vehicles as opposed to pursuit of a more optimal level of safety, working to ensure systems that work reliably and effectively when they need to, as opposed to, hey, just get better sensors on the vehicle at all times. This is not to say that cameras alone are enough for everything. They are not. But looking at reliability and robustness to detecting when we err and supporting us in that moment. And the data exists here to begin doing that. It's just we have to move away from this technology force mindset that vehicle engineering is chasing Silicon Valley, and to move back to a much more human-centered mindset to thinking about how we as humans are supported in the role we're building. And we can think about this even bigger within the auto industry and mobility as a whole, and thinking about how how the system as a whole works and how we pay for mobility and are charged, and how this data can begin to use to mitigate some of the costs associated. And that's some of the work that's just kind of starting to think up and move forward with these days.
And Bryan, one of the things that floored me when I first started talking with you and hearing you speak to audiences, you mentioned that the better the technology's performing, in many ways, the more dangerous the scenario becomes. So can you speak to that?
So automation complacency is the technical term, but in the simplistic side, we as humans are lazy creatures. The more we automate, the lazier we have a tendency to be. So you see this in the prime stage of AI these days. The more folks are using ChatGPT without reading it, they're creating work slop. I can create a 10-page manuscript by giving ChatGPT a short prompt. So, if I want to be lazy, it's really easy. That's the default, sit in front of the TV and pay no attention. So it is hard for humans without an optimal level of stress or workload to attend over a long period of time to an operational task of driving a vehicle. But we're expected to look at the road, observe threats, and respond to them at all times. That's something humans are innately not really good at. So amazingly, the vast majority of miles traveled are traveled safely. We overcome our limitations to do okay. But instead of looking at technology to replace human skill, automate the world, let's flip that around. How do we use the technology to support human skill more effectively? You know what? AI and automation is really good at black and white decisions. Quite frankly, many of the algorithms are being tuned on their ability to separate cats from dogs. But when it comes to the complexities of real life, we have yet to build artificial intelligence or automation technology that works seamlessly. Human expertise seems to be needed all over the place, and we only have to look at our daily lives with the smart technologies around us to recognize, I had to figure out a new way to get into Zoom today, adjust my smartphone for something, or think about what buttons I have to push to make coffee again. So we're creating devices that are more and more complex because we feel we need to, and losing sight of the human's role in the system. And human's role is perhaps the most important role when it comes to advancing safety in many of the environments we're talking about here today.
And I think it's we're so there's a link to Bryan's book, which is How to Make AI Useful. I heavily recommend that you read it. And I was captivated when I started, and now I need a quiet weekend, which will be coming up. But it's the right conversation at the right time. This irony that the more the car performs well and the more you trust it, the worse you are as a driver. And then when the unexpected happens, and it does happen, the less you become able to take over and do something about it. And we see this time and time again.
So this is not just in cars. I mean, the FAA admitted years ago pilot skill was eroding at the expense of automation in the cockpit and encouraging the pilots to use manual flight operations at times. Now, the airlines don't want pilots using manual flight operations because they're more fuel efficient when they're not flying. The autopilots, quite frankly, more fuel efficient. Now, when I gave my first keynote on highly automated driving well over a decade ago, I had a slide in there about skill atrophy. And the slide goes something like this: as long as vehicles miles traveled equals vehicles miles driven, we're learning as we drive. But the more vehicles miles traveled diverges from vehicles miles driven, i.e. we're not always driving anymore, the less I'm acquiring the skills needed to predict and mitigate the next situation. The same fundamentals apply over to the AI world. Now, we have to embrace that skill atrophy is real. Many of us lack the situational understanding of how to get from point A to point B without GPS these days. That's the skill atrophy elements playing in real life. Remember getting lost as a kid and having to find your way home. God knows where we were. When we look at automation as a whole, we are going to see more and more situations of skill atrophy impacting our lives. And we need to understand where that needs to be mitigated and where we can live with losing the skills and relying on the new capabilities that we have. And this is a really strategic conversation that the auto industry, regulators, insurers, and other stakeholders need to begin to have. Drivers today are nowhere near as skilled as they were a decade ago, or 2 decades ago, when power steering and anti-lock brakes are making it easier to take a hand off the wheel and do other things. We look into other countries around the world where driving is much more of a privilege than a right. To get a driver's license in Germany is a much more complex process than it is here in the States. So we need to be thinking very holistically on how do we improve this system, and taking a strategic viewpoint as opposed to our continual patching and saying a little of this and a little of that. It's not getting us where we need to go.
About once a month or so, Brian and I get together and we do have a coffee chat, and they can go on forever, and we don't have that time with you guys. We're going to get to some questions. And Tracy comes in and helps us with those questions. Hi, Tracy.
Hi, everybody. Okay, well, yeah, we did have some questions come in, so let's go ahead and get started. Doesn't the incorporation of machine logic, aka artificial intelligence, make it practically impossible to reconcile safety requirements with operational data?
Tracy, that's a good question. And system safety, and specifically traditional functional safety, is very difficult to prove with AI-based systems. If you can't recreate the math, it is almost entirely impossible at this point to prove the safety case. And that's why a lot of the vehicle manufacturers and automated vehicle developers are not relying on end-to-end learning approaches. They are relying on more traditional metrics of system safety, where they can mathematically prove things. You see some new age companies, Tesla being a great example, but not the only one there, who are moving to a point that they cannot prove system safety to the degree that legacy players would require. Now, they are not being held accountable in the environment we live in, the self-certification environment, for these decisions. And I am not going to sit here and preach that approach one or approach two is the right answer, because I do believe over the long term, artificial intelligence will do things that we could only conceive of today. But at the end of the day, retrospectively, I do think we need to have a deep conversation about data stewardship and how do we triage whether these systems actually do work in real world performance situations and don't. So, okay, if you create an artificial intelligence system that can move from point A to point B, you can't tell me how I got there, but you have the data to demonstrate why it is safe 99.999% of the time, that's okay. But if you can't prove to me beyond reasonable doubt why retrospectively you met that safety standard, let's not even start this conversation. And we look at a couple of the providers out there today. You only have to look skin deep at the data to say they're not being transparent with even the data they have.
So attending our chat today is Phil Koopman, who's viciously nodding his head up and down when you start talking about the safety case. And he's been recent speakers, and we'll be having another chat with him as well. But that's something he really cares about. I'm going to try to explain it from a human perspective. It's really hard. You actually have two different dynamics going on. How do you make the car more autonomous? And you start to use that with higher forms of technology, and you start to migrate into artificial intelligence. The harder it is to digest whether or not the car is actually safe doing so. That's really the two frameworks. So, and there are engineers all over the world just completely nuts that these cars are doing what they're doing, but they're doing it because A, the public wants them, and B, these cars are filling a void because people want this driving experience that doesn't drive quite as much. And car manufacturers need the miles to learn, and then car manufacturers want to sell cars. So where it's this crazy world where we're making the cars in some ways at least harder to understand, in many ways more dangerous in ways people didn't anticipate. And we're in this point where we're going to have to find our way to the best place we can. So, Bryan, can we get to the next question, Tracy?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
sure. There's another one that came in from the audience. How do you think the OEMs would oppose NHTSA requiring them to disclose what information they obtain and record for each vehicle, as well as providing the owner with the data upon the owner or leasee request?
I think many of the manufacturers would highly object to NHTSA requesting such data for competitive practices. I think that we have to take an alternative positive approach to encouraging the manufacturers to see a value chain from that data to get it out reasonably. Two reasons. First, it is by far at scale not low cost to extract this data. It's really easy for some manufacturers to go and get a little piece. But at scale to bring the data out is a massive undertaking for the likes of the auto manufacturers and the big tech behind that. We can all think about the Amazon outage yesterday. So I think we need to find value propositions that both justify the investment and the scale needed to get that data out, and turn an ROI for the manufacturers here in doing that. Because while we are very quick to critique the manufacturers for a lot of their decision making, you know what? These are companies that by and large are not economically stable organizations at this point. They are investing billions of dollars in technology that is not making the market, and most of them economically aren't doing so well. So bringing these companies into a world where they can both monetize some of the data for societal benefit and improve our system while balancing the operational cost to do that, to me makes sense. So NHTSA mandating, I think you get a heck no, we won't go. But I think that the insurance companies and the OEMs finding a way to work together to operationalize this data in positive ways, while absolutely protecting consumer privacy in data ownership issues, might be the best tool to get this data out strategically.
Yeah, so Bryan, that actually tees up a perfect segue for what I'd like to contribute here, and then we'll get to our last question. We close out at the top of the hour, okay? So NHTSA just issued a recall notice on Texas full self-driving. And the recall notice, I don't have it in front of me right now, and I don't have what I wrote, but I wrote something in response to this. It wasn't even something they wanted, but they said, we're looking at full self-driving. And I don't want to get into a long discussion about autopilot versus full self-driving versus what other car manufacturers call it. But they issued this recall about full self-driving. And they say, we're looking at these couple unique sets of circumstances: intersections, stop signs, maybe cars leaving the lane of travel. The car manufacturers are required under what's called the standing general order to report an accident when it's claimed that the car was in automation mode. So a human being says, hey, I had an accident and I was in automation mode. So the standard general order requires that car manufacturer to send a report. So they noted in their materials that they had 44 cases where full self-driving was at issue. And they reported that there were, I think it was 29 injuries in those full self-driving events. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I see 29 of these a month. And there's so many more injuries. And one of the videos we did want to show you, and we couldn't get it up, and next podcast we will, is a woman, she unfortunately died while a Tesla in full self-driving mode didn't detect the traffic ahead. She was out of her car on a highway. So I know that's not in there because it said no fatalities. So I invited them to have a dialogue. but I also asked them to consider other aspects of this. So we got 3 minutes left. Tracy, does that give us enough room to get to another question?
Yeah, we've got this one here for Bryan. Bryan, how did you get from studying driver assistance and automated vehicles to AI? And are there any lessons or takeaways?
So, Tracy, that's a great question. Automated vehicles were really predicated on the advancement of AI. In essence, AI was going to increase in so effectively that it was going to enable all this automation to take hold and accelerate. The amount of synergies between automated vehicles and AI are very intriguing. For one, I'm a big believer that AI is really a tool that can help support us, much like we see driver assistance today. As we try to automate more and more, the human, is going to get lazy, is not going to do, and then you have the situation where you reduce your workforces to automate, and all of a sudden the complexities get involved, and no one can solve these challenges, and you're bringing workforce, increased technical workforce in and more labor and manpower to enhance. So I think that there are an enormous amount of synergies between AI and automated vehicles. Both are presumed to be magic, solving complexities of daily life. But in reality, both need to be developed from a human-centered perspective, looking at the technologies to support humanity as opposed to evolving the technologies to solve a technical goal. And so I think there are some really interesting and important synergies there. And we get too much in both of these ladders, have focused so much on technology, technology, technology. Now, what's your question? The reality is how are we going to support the human's role with this technology? And that is just the fundamental synergy and the fundamental story of our time. How do we use technology to make us better? And that's the major thesis of my work in automated vehicles, and has really moved over into the AI world.
So with the 1 minute left, I'm going to close up with one comment. So Bryan was talking about how the availability of data is not as easy as you think. But our work at Nelson Law and at Quantum Risk is showing that the data is more available than most people know. Available in more car manufacturers than you know. And so you have to think of, if a car is a 2020 or better, that increases the likelihood the data is somewhat available. If the car is electrified, it makes it somewhat more available. If the car has automated features, more chances of it being available. And you really don't want to go to the car. You want to avoid that exercise at all costs for a lot of reasons. But at the same point, if you have something you're looking at and you need to make sure the right things are understood about what took place, you got to make sure you preserve the evidence too. So with that, Tracy, as always, thanks a lot for supporting everything we've done. And Bryan, I can't tell you how much I know the audience appreciates your participation. Very rarely do they get to hear words like hexadecimal referred to as hex. But thank you very much for bringing the intelligence you bring to these kind of conversations. And audience, just so much appreciate you guys tuning in and being so participant.
Mike, thanks for having me. I think to step back, look, automation and AI can change us for the better, but we need to think about how do we use this wisely in support of us as humans, as opposed to just the fact that we need better technology. We're at the center of it all.
Well, thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next month, okay?